Okay, so there's the finishing touches on this potentially BAFTA award-winning screenplay. Okay, now where was I? Hello and welcome to So Much for Pathos, the show that repeatedly kicks Hollywood up the arse of a pair of steel-toe cat clown shoes whilst maniacally honking a little horn. I'll be your detective for this evening. So as well as investigating Christopher Nolan's next film, today is our first case of a remake, so let's investigate 2002's Insomnia. But first, let's go over the case notes. Insomnia, directed by Erik Skjoldberg as his debut, is a 1997 Norwegian thriller starring Stellan Skarsgård. Co-written by Skjoldberg and Nikolai Frobenius, Insomnia tells the story of Jonas Ekström, played by Skarsgård, a police officer investigating the murder of a 17-year-old girl in Tromsø, far up in the Norwegian Arctic. What makes the story unique, however, is that as the town is situated within the Arctic Circle, it experiences 24-hour sunlight in midsummer, which means that over the entire course of the film, the sun never sets. At the end of the first act, when Jonas finds the killer's whereabouts, a chase ensues in the midst of a dense fog, and Jonas accidentally ends up shooting and killing his partner. After directly lying to his colleagues about his partner's killing, things take a turn for the worse when the killer they're looking for calls Jonas and tells him that he saw him do it. What ensues is a story about Jonas desperately covering his tracks from the cops as he is drawn closer and closer to the killer and further into darkness, all whilst ironically in the presence of the overbearing brightness of the 24-hour sunlight, making Jonas unable to adjust to the climate and igniting him a sense of unrelenting unrest, giving him the insomnia of the title. It was rather well received at the time, enough to warrant a Criterion Blu-ray re-release back in July of this year, and supposedly a young Christopher Nolan had seen it upon its initial theatrical run in 1997. Shortly afterwards, Warner Bros. Sought to remake it with screenwriter Hilary Seitz, which piqued the interest of Alcon Entertainment, who came on board as producers, and eventually Steven Soderbergh and George Clooney, who were producing partners under the then recently founded Section 8. Soderbergh, who had seen Memento, which had been nominated for 2 Oscars for editing and screenplay, enthusiastically sought after Christopher Nolan to direct. Warners, who were initially hesitant because they wanted a much more seasoned professional at the helm, took a chance on Nolan after he screened Memento for them, perhaps in a bid to prove that he knew what he was doing. With casting finalised to Al Pacino, Hilary Swank and Robin Williams, Christopher Nolan shot Insomnia for roughly $50 million in Alaska, on a 53-day shooting schedule that ended in June of 2001 in order to meet a May 28, 2002 release date. And what did he end up making? Well, let's take a look. So seeing as both versions of Insomnia have the same plot, to avoid boring anyone I'll just make note of the significant changes. In Nolan's Insomnia we meet Detective Will Dormer, played by Al Pacino. You see what they did there with the name? Will Dormer? As in dormant? Oh, forget it. As he travels via plane to Alaska to investigate the crime. Specific note is made in both cases that the criminal was meticulous and calm in both execution and aftermath, meaning that a certain level of close attention must be paid to the finer details of the crime, which becomes a source of tension when both Jonas and Will find themselves unable to sleep due to the midnight sun. Dormer, however, is distracted even before he arrives, due to a subplot involving an ongoing internal affairs investigation of his and his partner Hap's homicide department back in Los Angeles. This is introduced early on in the film when Dormer and Hap discuss the inquiry over dinner on their first night in Alaska, and Hap basically warns him in advance that he's about to turn whistleblower to save his own neck, leaving Dormer to eat shit waffles. Well, if you know anything about supporting characters in crime stories, you'll be certain that Will's Nathan Fillion lookalike partner is totally going to die, especially seeing as he's got the survival instincts of a chocolate biscuit on a coffee cup scuba diving holiday. The other major change is that rather than basically getting away with killing his partner as Jonas does in the original, Dormer dies at the end, and the choice of whether to bring the truth to light is left with the female detective who found him out. Most other changes are merely cosmetic ones, such as the Alaskan setting, the character names and such, and whilst the changes do serve a purpose, as I will explain, ultimately not much separates the Nolan Insomnia from the Norwegian original, with the exception of a larger budget, with the result that it feels like it's missing something. Insomnia is probably going to be remembered as Christopher Nolan's least popular movie, and that's not me trying to tell you that I don't think it's any good. In fact, it's actually really good, but what I'm saying is his least showy or least visually spectacular film, with the possible exception of maybe Following. Despite having a good eye for philosophical details, Nolan's movies have a tendency to come front-loaded with very highly, quote, cinematic moments. The opening bank robbery from The Dark Knight, the cityscape folding over itself moment from Inception, and so on. But Insomnia is unique in that it doesn't really have any of those types of moments. In fact, there's not really much that distinguishes it as a Christopher Nolan movie at all. There is of course familiar plot elements such as the flawed hero and themes of guilt and memory, but these are all superficial details that have already been covered way more competently in Nolan's previous 2 works. It's a Christopher Nolan movie in execution, but not much in the way of design. In other words, it becomes tragically easy to tell that Christopher Nolan is essentially a director for hire here, especially when you consider this the first movie he's directed that he didn't also write the screenplay for. Having said that though, it does stand up well as its own movie, and there's actually a lot to like. like. Unfortunately, it falls into the same trap that a lot of other remakes fall into, where it doesn't quite have enough ideas of its own, nor does it quite differ from the original to justify its existence. But it does at least try and distinguish itself, and besides, even if it were one of those remakes that simply should have never been commissioned, it is still important to give credit where writers and directors have made something good out of it. Like this one, and this one, and... well, you still have to be honest. So what are the strengths of this film looked at on its own merits, and in comparison with the original, and in comparison with the rest of Nolan's work? Well, let's investigate, shall we? One of the praises consistently thrown at Christopher Nolan is that his works often have a very strong character base, which is where most of the tension and drama emanate from. And whilst the original movie functions best as a theme piece in the Edgar Allan Poe mould of things, where the characters are used as avatars for certain ideas, in the hands of Christopher Nolan this turns into a psychological character drama where the protagonist is hiding lies behind lies beneath lies to get himself out of dodge. Nolan's Insomnia is a very stripped down affair, telling a personal story of a man travelling a road to darkness without a car, and the relative smallness of the story, contrasted with the foggy Alaskan setting, allows itself for some marvellous cinematography. Which is my cue to introduce you to one of the unsung heroes of Christopher Nolan's team of collaborators, Wally Pfister. Wally Pfister began his career originally as a cameraman for documentaries and news crews, soon getting his big break by being hired by Robert Altman to shoot Tanner 88, after which he cut his teeth for a while working under people like Roger Corman and Greg Dark, making straight-to-video erotic thrillers and horror movies. Sometimes they were one in the same. During this time, Pfister had learned an enormous amount from his contemporaries, so by the time he met Christopher Nolan at the 1998 Sundance Film Festival, he was ready to apply his craft. His first official outing with Nolan as cinematographer was Memento, which was pretty good in the camera work department, although that film is better known for its editing. Pfister is back working for Christopher Nolan again for Insomnia here, and his work is a substantial improvement. With Pfister's help, Christopher Nolan doesn't so much film a location as he does create a psychological landscape. That fog sequence in particular is an outstanding example of this. Nolan here is very good at visually depicting the fatigue of the central character. Take this sequence where Will looks around the police station. The background audio, which would normally be ambient, gets turned up slightly, with certain Foley effects becoming more prominent. Also note that Christopher Nolan shoots Al Pacino's reaction shots with a telephoto lens, compressing the space between the camera, Al Pacino and the background, somehow giving the impression of tightness or claustrophobia. Essentially what Nolan does here is he keeps the themes implicit in the visual storytelling, which can serve as a backdrop for a character piece. At least that way you're able to get great character moments, such as the parts where Will struggles frantically to get to sleep, but instead focusing on the character's turmoil rather than the theming. I suppose the main difference between the two movies is ultimately the two directors at the helm, both applying different styles and storytelling techniques. It's actually quite interesting watching both movies back to back and watching how two different filmmakers tackle the same basic premise and theming. So let's expand on that for a moment. Regardless of either director, what are the themes in the Insomnia story? Think about what the movie represents in both cases. Never before was the metaphor of the sun most apt in a story about guilt. The sun, in both versions of Insomnia, function as a reworking of the concepts of the telltale heart of Edgar Allan Poe, a manifestation of conscience continually tormenting a killer, a bit like the benevolent eye of God or Sauron, depending on your outlook on life. But what really works here is that it breaks it down into its literal meaning, the symbolism of light and darkness with regard to guilt, which people have been using for a millennia, from Tolkien to Jesus. In both films, the main character, while struggling to conceal his responsibility for the death of his partner, is blinded or overwhelmed by the light and must keep himself in the dark. But no matter how hard the protagonist tries to retreat into the shadows, both literally and metaphorically, the light relentlessly shines through until he cannot take it anymore. When Roger Ebert reviewed Insomnia back in 1997, he made an interesting comparison to Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. It's a comparison worth making, as both stories share a lot of common features, although actually more so in the case of Nolan's version. In Crime and Punishment, the protagonist, Raskolnikov, murders a pawnbroker he finds unpleasant, partially on irrational impulse, but also reasoning he can do good with her money. The shock of the crime, however, renders him feverish and delirious with guilt, to the point where he almost incriminates himself through his behaviour, much like the detective protagonist's sleeplessness and deterioration in either Insomnias. Raskolnikov's confession to his lover is overheard by a man called Svidrigailov? We'll call him Sid for now. Is overheard by a man named Sid. He wants to pressure Raskolnikov's sister into marrying him so he may use it against him. Raskolnikov is about to go to the police and confess when he hears that Sid has shot himself. He's then faced with the choice of whether to remain silent and get away with the crime, or confess anyway and thereby end the lies and crippling guilt. A choice directly mirroring the final dilemma of Insomnia. Crime and Punishment is fundamentally a morality tale. Dostoevsky intensely dislikes the nihilistic and utilitarian approaches to personal ethics which were in vogue in Russian intellectual circles at the time, particularly Bazarovism, which seemed to support support the notion of great-minded individuals being above the law. At the start of the novel, Raskolnikov is very arrogant, seeing himself as being above the normal rules and laws of society to the extent of being able to carry out a justified murder. This same sense of being above, such that he can decide whether the ends justify the means, can be seen in Dormer's planting of evidence in Dodd's apartment before the events of the film, as well as the manipulation of evidence in the investigation of his partner's shooting.
That's what I do. It's my job. I assign guilt. You find the evidence, figure out who did it, and then you go get them and put them away.
Dormer thinks he knows better than everyone else that, as the smartest man in the room, what is right and wrong is his to determine. Over the course of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov goes from swaggering, proud and impulsive to humbled, as his murder turns out to be neither enriching nor as consequence-free, at least inwardly, as he had thought. In this respect, both Crime and Punishment and Insomnia could also be compared to A Simple Plan, another story where the natural consequences of a crime are worse than getting caught would have been. In Crime and Punishment, the murderer, Raskolnikov, confesses and he's sent to Siberia. In both versions of Insomnia, the film ends with the final choice between confession and concealment not having been made. Whether or not the truth will, or indeed should, come out is left to the audience's imagination. However, Dormer dies asking Ellie to bring the truth to light and not to compromise her own integrity as he had.
Nobody needs to know. You didn't mean to do it, and I know that, even if you don't.
No, don't.
Like Dostoevsky's Raskolnikov, the sickness induced by guilt, i.e. his insomnia, has broken and humbled him into accepting that he is not above the law or above others, nor is he above the truth.
You don't get to pick when you tell the truth. The truth is beyond that.
This is actually one of the most significant differences between Nolan's Insomnia and the original. In Skjoldberg's version, the detective Ekström is so hard-bitten throughout that it's hard to tell how much his attitude has actually changed by the end, with the result that he doesn't have much of a character arc. I'm still at best on the fence as to how necessary this remake was, but one of its definite strengths compared to the original is how Dormer genuinely changes by the end, as the way he views himself and his actions is challenged and tested. This is also, we should not forget, a change made by Nolan himself in his director's pass on the final screenplay, along with the entire internal affairs subplot and the ambiguities this allows the screenplay to explore. Although this is the one film he's directed that he didn't also write the screenplay for, it does certainly bear his mark. Another strength of the film is its casting. Christopher Nolan is and always has been an exceptional actor's director. Let's particularly look at the late great Robin Williams' turn as the film's antagonist, writer and murderer Walter Finch. Walter Finch is the equivalent of John Holt from Skjoldberg's version, an author whose killing of a young girl kicks off the events of the film. What's immediately remarkable when comparing how Williams and Floberg have played their respective characters is how differently they've made them. They're scripted almost identically, both kill a girl after losing control, both calculate and connive, both expressing admiration for the police, both claim the girl's death was an accident whilst also admitting to pondering the nature of murder in a less than healthy way, and both are killed following an armed struggle at least partly caused by losing emotional control again. And yet, they come off as profoundly different in their motivations. Holt is a more straightforwardly dislikable character, more confident in his manipulations. He's a character driven very much by aggression, by anger bubbling underneath the surface. Robin Williams' Walter Finch, by contrast, seems to want to be liked. See here the pleading expressions when he looks at Pacino like he wants to be believed and accepted, or even when he can't physically see him, like this great characterisation scene when Finch phones Dormer in the night.
He comes over, she's distraught, a little drunk. And, she starts telling me about how Randy and Tanya are carrying on.
I only wanted to comfort her, hold her. I kissed her and got a little excited.
She started laughing at me. She wouldn't stop laughing.
You ever had somebody laugh at you when you're like that? Well, I mean, when you're really vulnerable.
Laughing their ass off at you.
He's a more introverted, self-pitying character. His body language is very reserved, his arms are kept close in, he normally has his hands clasped in his pockets, and he has a stiff, hunched-over walk like he's perpetually on the verge of panicking or running off. He speaks very softly, and his speech is interspersed with apologetic movements of brow and mouth, his eye contact frequent but brief, all denoting an awkward, shy individual. Then when he does cut loose, he seems to be driven by fear more than anger. You get the impression of a repressed, cowardly loner who loses control from time to time. This serves as a great example of what an actor can bring to a pre-existing role, because we get all of this this from Robin Williams' performance. He could easily have portrayed Finch in the same aggressive beast under the skin vein as Floberg's John Holt while reading from the exact same script. This envisioning of the killer, however, better serves the story as it allows for greater ambiguity over the circumstances of the original killing, so that Finch and Pacino's Dormer can effectively be juxtaposed. It also means that the more extensive interactions between Dormer and Finch don't ring false, as Fincher comes across as simply more reasonable than Holt. You don't really doubt that Holt meant to kill his victim, and he has this subtle crazy dancing around his eyes which makes you suspect he will eventually do it again. With Williams' performance, you half believe him, so you end up with a man you're not quite sure did mean to kill a girl thrown together with a cop you're not quite sure didn't mean to kill his partner. Not to undersell Pacino's performance in these scenes, you understand. These conversations between the policeman and the killer largely consist of comparing the murder of Kay Connell by Finch with Dormer shooting of his own partner Hap, and could easily have seemed forced or contrived. The fact that they don't is a testament to the strong chemistry between the two lead actors. But for me, the sum total of all this is that you end up with a beautiful looking, precisely executed and overall rather well conceived work of unnecessity. I can't help but be biased, mainly because it's a remake and I think remakes are bloody stupid. This isn't helped by the fact that most studios greenlight remakes as little more than cynical cash grabs for the terminally uncreative. I mean, let's face uncomfortable facts here. No remake has ever really been able to justify its existence or bring anything particularly new to the table, with the possible exception of Scarface, War of the Worlds, Ocean's 11, The Departed and True Grit, maybe. Having said that though, cultural remakes are always interesting in as much as it's interesting to see how filmmakers from another nationality tackle plot elements that are culturally specific to the region that they originate from, albeit there is the element of cultural reappropriation, which is a whole topic for another day. My feelings on remakes, reboots and sequels have remained the same over the years. There ultimately is no point unless you seriously have a way of improving the original story or using said story as a springboard for new ideas, and sadly Insomnia doesn't ever seem to fully achieve that, which feels like heresy to say considering I'm talking about the man that took Batman from this to this. In conclusion, the film certainly does do a lot of things right, and now I have to answer the inevitable question of whether I would recommend seeing it. I suppose what it ultimately comes down to in a case like this is the question of was I entertained, and whilst I certainly was, my recommendation is going to come with something of an asterisk next to it. I was entertained because it's an interesting and thought-provoking parable about guilt told visually by an excellent storyteller, but in my opinion Nolan's remake doesn't add enough that's particularly new or interesting to a story that already works as well as it does. The screenplay is overall really good and serves as a platform for some outstanding performances from Al Pacino and Robin Williams, but taken as an overall piece within Christopher Nolan's back catalogue, I feel I'm justified in saying that this will probably be one of his lesser remembered works. Please don't get me wrong when I tell you any of this, it's overall a slickly produced and well executed film. It's just that your appetite will have been ruined if you already saw the Norwegian version. It's not a perfect movie, but no movie is, except a hypothetical Godfather sequel starring Marlon Brando as a gigantic disembodied boob. Anyway, on that note, I'm calling it case closed because there's really not much else to talk about. I'm Matt Crowley, that was Insomnia, and join us next time when Batman begins.